I never thought a strip of asphalt could mean so much to me. But that road wasn't just any road. It was my road. I poured sweat, time, and every spare dollar I had into making it what it was. Years ago, when I bought my property on the edge of town, there wasn't even a path leading up to my land, just a mess of mud and gravel that swallowed truck tires like quicksand every time it rained. I hauled stone, leveled the earth, poured concrete where it mattered, and widened the path enough for trucks to get in and out without scraping against the overgrowth. It was brutal work, and for a long time it felt thankless, but that road became something of a symbol to me. It wasn't just a way to get in and out of my property. It was proof that I could build something with my own two hands. That mattered, because back then I didn't have much. My marriage had fallen apart. My savings were almost gone, and I needed something to remind myself I could still stand on my own. That road was it. And for years, I thought it would stay mine, untouched, unquestioned, respected. But then came the HOA. The Homeowners Association wasn't supposed to exist out here, at least not when I first settled. The land I bought was on the outer edge of what had once been farmland, before developers swooped in and turned everything around it into cookie-cutter houses, with identical driveways and identical mailboxes. At first, I didn't care. My land sat on a hill overlooking their subdivision, a good half-mile away. They had their rules, their neat lawns, their constant newsletters about paint colors and acceptable flower beds, but none of it had anything to do with me. I wasn't in their boundaries. I wasn't under their thumb. I was free. Or at least, I thought I was. It started small, the way most invasions do. A knock on the door one afternoon. 3 people standing on my porch with clipboard in hand, and practiced smiles on their faces. They introduced themselves as members of the community board. Though I noticed they never actually used the word HOA. They asked about my property lines, my plans for future development, whether I consider integrating with the larger community. I laughed, because at the time it seemed absurd. I told them I wasn't interested, that my land was mine, and I wasn't about to sign on to a list of arbitrary rules just to please neighbors I never asked for. They left with polite nods, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't like being told no. A few weeks later, I started noticing cars using my road. At first, it was just 1 or 2 neighbors from down the hill who wanted to cut across my land because it saved them 3 minutes getting to the main highway. I figured maybe they were lost, or maybe it was a one-time thing. But then it became routine. Every morning, a steady stream of SUVs and minivans crept past my gate, their tires grinding against the surface I had built. I confronted one of them once, a man in a button-up shirt with a tie dangling loose from his neck. He rolled down his window and waved like we were old friends. "Road's open, right?" he said, grinning as though that settled everything. When I told him it wasn't, his grin faltered, but he didn't apologize. He just kept driving. That's when I realized something was happening behind the scenes. And sure enough, a letter came in the mail. The HOA had voted to annex my road into their community infrastructure. Just like that. No discussion with me, no request, no compensation. They called it a public necessity, claiming that because so many residents were using it, it only made sense for it to be managed by the association. Managed, of course, meant owned. And in their mind, that meant my road was no longer mine. It was theirs. They even went as far as to put up a little wooden sign at the bottom of the hill that read, "Private Road, HOA access only." The gall of it nearly made my head spin. I called their office. They brushed me off. I went to their next meeting, where they acted surprised to see me, as though I were some stranger barging in where I didn't belong. When I brought up the fact that they had stolen my road without so much as a conversation, they flipped the script on me. One woman, with perfectly curled hair and an icy smile, leaned across the table and said, "You should be grateful, really. We're improving your property value by maintaining the road." Maintaining? They hadn't done a damn thing, except put their sign on it. I was the one who patched the cracks when winter ice split the asphalt. I was the one who trimmed back the trees, so trucks wouldn't get scratched on the way up. I was the one who poured every cent into keeping it drivable. And now they had the audacity to claim it was theirs? I walked out of that meeting with a fury in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Something deep down in me, The part that had built that road with my bare hands. The part that had been kicked down one too many times and had learned to fight back. Decided right then and there I wasn't going to let it slide. They wanted to take what was mine without asking. They wanted to parade around like they could dictate my life just because they had a committee and some rules printed on cheap paper. Fine. They'd learned the hard way what it meant to push me. And so the planning began. I didn't rush into it, though that's not how I work. If there's one thing life has taught me, it's that revenge served cold lasts longer and cuts deeper. I started by watching. Every morning and every evening, I noted who used the road. I set up a trail camera tucked into the trees, capturing license plates and faces as they passed. I learned patterns. The family in the silver minivan who used it at 7:15 every morning sharp. The guy in the red pickup who sped through at night like he was trying to outrun his own shadow. The woman who stopped halfway up to check her phone before moving on. They thought the road was theirs now. They thought they could do whatever they wanted. But I was taking notes, and every note was a nail in the coffin of their arrogance. Meanwhile, I played nice to their faces. When I ran into a board member at the gas station, I smiled, nodded, even held the door open. Let them think I'd rolled over. Let them believe I was beaten. Because the more comfortable they felt, the less they watched me, and the more freedom I had to prepare. And preparation was everything. The idea came to me one night when I was sitting on my porch, watching a line of headlights snake up my road like ants crawling toward food that didn't belong to them. I thought about how much they depended on that shortcut now, how they'd integrated it into their routines so deeply they couldn't imagine giving it up. And I thought about their cars, shiny, polished, status symbols they treated like extensions of their own identities. That's when it clicked. If they could take my road without asking, I could take something from them, too. Something they valued, something they thought was untouchable. I could vanish their cars. Not destroy them, not damage them. That would have been too obvious, too messy. No, I wanted something cleaner, sharper. I wanted them to wake up one morning and find that everything they thought they controlled was gone, without a trace. Just like that. But to do that, I needed a plan. A real one. And I needed patience, because if I moved too fast, they'd catch on. So I spent weeks laying the groundwork, preparing the space, gathering what I needed. And every day, as I watched them drive over the road I built, the fire inside me grew hotter. They thought they'd won. They thought the HOA's word was law. But they had no idea what was coming for them. Because I wasn't just going to take my road back. I was going to teach them what it meant to steal from a man like me. They always said the law was on their side. They loved to toss that phrase around like a talisman. Like repeating it enough would make it true. We operate within the law. The president of the board had told me at that meeting, folding his hands as if he were giving a sermon. He liked the sound of his own voice. He liked the weight his title carried. But the law, like everything else, is a tool. One man's protection can be another man's cage depending on who's holding it. I'd learned that the hard way when people with showy titles tried to paper over greed with rules printed in small fonts. That's why my plan couldn't rely on rage alone. It had to be surgical. Precision, not chaos. I mapped the neighborhood like it was a battlefield. I watched utility schedules, garbage pickups, PDA meetings. Anything that would tell me where people were likely to be at certain times and where they were likely to be most vulnerable. You'd be surprised how much people reveal in the small routines they never think about. The woman who walked her dog at 7 every morning. The elderly man who collected his mail at noon on Wednesdays. The teenage boy who always left for soccer practice at 4:30. Patterns became my blueprints. I remember the first time I actually touched one of their cars. Well, not touch in the obvious sense. Not with my hands. It was more like a rehearsal. I parked across from the subdivision one damp evening and watched as the headlights slid into driveways like moths returned to porch lights. I wanted to know how long it took for them to lock doors after shutting off engines, whether any of the houses left cars in the driveways overnight, whether garages were kept open or closed. I took notes. I sat in my truck with the heater running just to keep myself from getting too cold and scrawled observations on the pad of paper I kept in the glove box. The more I watched, the clearer it became a lot of them were careless. They trusted their gated community and their neatly printed rules So much they stopped thinking. And that pretended security would be their undoing. I could have gone for intimidation. Leave notes on windshields, spray paint messages on the pavement. Something to shame them back into respecting a man's land. But that felt petty and, importantly, ineffective. They would just call the sheriff, print the notes in their community newsletter as harassment, and make themselves wear the martyr's hat. No, I wanted to hit them farther down the line. Something that would force the HOA's board to look inward, to explain how their so-called governance could be so thin as to allow tens of thousands of dollars worth of property to simply disappear overnight. Something that would make neighbors stop and whisper at meetings and question the board's competence and their entitlement. I wanted their cars to vanish in a way that demanded answers, not just finger-pointing. So I leaned into my skill set, mechanic work, a little welding, a lot of patience, and a mind for small, reliable sabotage that left no permanent mark. I'd worked on engines since I was a kid, helping my dad under the hood of a battered Ford that coughed and wheezed, but somehow kept us moving. There's a rhythm you learn when you deal with machines, the way a piston sounds when it's healthy, the slight hesitation when a timing belt's about to fail. Cars, like people, give off signals if you know how to listen. I started with simple things. A dead battery left overnight in a seldom-used minivan. A tire slowly deflating on a coach that always sat in the same place. Fuses pulled and tucked away so that when someone turned a key at dawn, their dash would stay dark. None of these acts destroyed anything. They only made the car absent, an invisible hole where something familiar should be. People would think they'd misplaced keys, thought they'd parked somewhere else, assumed someone had borrowed the car. That confusion was delicious in its own way. It planted the first seeds of doubt. I didn't hit everyone at once. Patience was my ally. You can't start a fire by throwing a match and hope it will find kindling. You gather tinder, you whisper to it, and you wait until the breeze favors you. I picked targets deliberately. People who had been the loudest proponents of the HOA's annexation, who'd shown up at meetings with clipboards and smiles and that special brand of righteous condescension. There was a woman with the perfect husband's and mom's Instagram life who'd insisted repeatedly that community standards meant everyone must comply, even people on the fringes. There was a man who served as treasurer and kept talking about budget allocations for improvements, as though stealing my road was part of a charity project. I wanted them to feel the confusion first, because they'd be the ones who'd storm the meetings, demand answers, and force the board to look exposed in front of everyone else. When a car went missing under my watch, I watched the ripple effect more than the immediate commotion. The woman with the polished SUV left frantic voicemails for her husband. He called the police. They came, took the report, and smiled with the practiced pity of people who think crime is something that happens elsewhere. The treasurer's son spent an entire afternoon searching the subdivision's perimeter, like a man trying to find an errant dog. There were whispers about car theft and whether the neighborhood was really as safe as they'd been promised. I made sure whatever I did left no evidence and no fingerprints, just the empty space where a vehicle had been. That empty space grew into paranoia. But paranoia alone wouldn't shift the power balance. The HOA thrived on the illusion of control. If they could control the narrative, they could make themselves indispensable again. So I broadened the scope of my work to include small failures in the infrastructure they so loudly advertised as their triumph. Mailboxes that had been glued shut with a compound I mixed late at night and painted over. Sprinklers that tripped a circuit breaker at odd hours so lawns would turn patchy in the morning. The community sign at the entrance that read, "Welcome, Pride in our neighborhood," which suddenly leaned at a jaunty, unplanned angle after I subtly loosened its bolts. Each tiny failure was a note in a song meant to unsettle. People began to exchange their own theories. Teenagers with screwdrivers, disgruntled ex-employees of the landscaping crew, or more ominously, someone from outside who didn't belong there. They started meeting more often after that. The board called emergency sessions that filled the community room with folding chairs and angry people who wanted answers. The president of the HOA, the one who always liked to say the law, began to look smaller under fluorescent lights. He barked orders, threatened cameras, demanded neighborhood watches, and the members dutifully complied, setting up groups and assigning volunteers to patrol. I watched from the edge of the crowd when I could, blending in with the neighbors who had questions they were too afraid to voice at official meetings. I listened as they blamed one another and raked through lists of possible culprits. Me, of course, I blended into the background because that's where a man does his best work. Unseen, quiet, purposeful. At night, I would drive my truck up to the ridge behind the subdivision, sit on the hood, and watch the faint glow of porch lights like a constellation of small, content homes that thought themselves a fortress. The thing about fortresses is they often have the softest spots in places no one expects. The more fortified they felt, the less vigilant they were in the places that mattered. Eventually, someone suggested hiring an external security firm. That was the moment I knew they were losing control. When the board started talking about spending assessment dollars on cameras and patrols, someone inevitably brought up the road. They'd have to formalize access. They said, install gates, require passes. They wanted to lock the perimeter, but had no idea the perimeter had been porous for a long time. I let them talk. Let them waste their money on motion-activated cameras that faced the street and missed the alleys where I walked. Let them buy lights that glared into windows and created shadows I could dance in. Every dollar they spent trying to buy safety was another dollar taken from them. There was one night that sticks in my head more than most. Rain had come down in sheets, and for once the community's manicured lawns looked messy and defeated, like something the neighborhood wasn't prepared to handle. I had been watching a particular house where the woman who had led the annexation lived. A Victorian-style thing with manicured hedges and a garage that always smelled faintly of fresh paint. I waited until after midnight when the rain had slowed to a fat, steady drum on leaves. Her car was in the driveway, headlights off, wipers still wet. I moved like a shadow then, quick and efficient, and I made the smallest, most reversible change I'd yet tried. I took the car's key fob and placed it where a person would never look, the far corner of a seldom-used garden shed at the back of her property I had scouted a few days earlier. The next morning, that key would be missing. The hysteria would follow. But that key was also a message. We don't have to break things to be present. Sometimes absence is louder than noise. The morning came, and it happened exactly as I expected. Shrill voices, slamming doors, adamant declarations to call the police. She accused everyone she could think of, even the teenage kid who delivered the mail. When she came to me, furious and shaking, I kept my face neutral. "I haven't seen your keys," I said, and the desperation in her eyes was almost pitiful. She stormed off the community center to demand this be the last straw, the last indignity she'd accept. Meanwhile, her husband tore through every inch of the property like a man possessed, finding the keys tucked away in a corner of the shed where they'd sat overnight, damp from the rain. He looked at them, then at his wife, and the anger turned inward in a private, scalding way. It was a small victory, but it echoed. Over time, my campaign of absence did something I hadn't fully anticipated. It made people look at one another. They started questioning the board's competence and their own complacency. Private conversations at neighborhood barbecues turned quietly accusatory. "How did this happen?" people would mutter. "Who would do this?" They would look at the treasurer with a new uncertainty, at the president with a sliver of suspicion. Power, once assumed, becomes brittle when people start to doubt the hands that wield it. I watched that brittleness grow into cracks. I didn't stop there, of course. The next stages required more finesse and a steadier nerve. I expanded my operations to take advantage of local logistics. Road repair crews who came at dawn and left at noon, delivery schedules that never varied. The way people left their garages open on weekends when they believed in the sanctity of their cul-de-sacs. I learned to time my moves to the music of their lives, slipping in and out like a draft you only notice when the lights go out. Every van that misplaced its wheel, every car that refused to start, every missing key was arranged to provoke a reaction that would be just enough to make the HOA look inadequate and callous. They'd taken my road without asking. The rest was me teaching them to be careful, what they took for granted. And all the while, the road that was mine sat quiet, a ribbon of asphalt I walked at dusk and dawn, tasting the air, feeling the grain of the stone beneath my boots. I kept a small fire in my chest for when the time came to claim it back outright. But for now I was content to sow the doubts, to watch their perfect world wobble on the edges, and to know that the people who'd been so sure of themselves were beginning to feel a little less sure every day. They started calling it the incident. It was a neat, ominous label that the local paper loved because it implied drama without having to print blood or broken glass. I watched the headline through a fog of coffee in my kitchen one morning. Mysterious disappearances plague subdivision. HOA scrambles for answers, and felt that strange mixture of indication and something like sorrow. I hadn't set out to create a sensation. I'd set out to get my road back, to puncture the smug certainty of people who thought a little printed covenant could rearrange the lives of others without consequence. But there's a way that events gain momentum once you let them loose. They start meaning things to other people that you never intended. Neighbors who had lived there 10 years and more now lined up at the community center with lists and grievances that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with the anxiousness I had stirred. Old slights were brought back into the light. Families argued about whether the kids should still walk to school without parents escorting them. Safety became a new religion, and with every prayer they threw money at it. Security gates, more cameras, a consultant who charged by the hour and smiled like a bank loan. At the meetings, people talked over one another in a way that made my ribs ache watching from the side. The treasurer, his cheeks flushed with caffeine and embarrassment, kept trying to point out the fiscal impact. Increased assessments, the cost of contracted patrols, the public relations damage. The president declaimed the law, as if that chant alone could summon competence. But the most interesting thing to me was the way ordinary faces contorted with a new suspicion. Some looked at their neighbors like strangers who might be hiding a knife in a pocket. Others looked genuinely afraid that the little world they built might not be as impermeable as they once believed. That look, equal parts confusion, fear, and betrayed entitlement, was almost a relief to watch, because entitlement is brittle when faced with the unknown. People began to change their routines. The woman with the polished SUV who had been the most vocal in the annexation put a heavy bolt on her garage door and stopped leaving the car outside, preferring to drive it in circles around the block until the engine warmed and the radio provided a kind of false company. Kids were now accompanied to soccer practice by 3 grown-ups taking turns. The board instituted an entry log for any visitors, a ridiculous thing that made their lives more complicated and theirs alone. They posted flyers with cheesy silhouettes of criminals and a number for the local non-emergency line, as if criminals planned their actions around HOA newsletters. The small rituals that had once comforted them, morning coffee on the porch, children playing the cul-de-sac, were now underlined by the hum of anxiety, the thin sound of a string being plucked until it frayed. I watched all of it and felt the satisfaction of one who was right in injustice, but also something heavier, an unease that came from the knowledge that causing chaos, even righteous chaos, leaves collateral. A woman I used to exchange a nod and a hello was stopped by my property one afternoon, her usual animation replaced by a nervous hesitation. She clutched a paper cup, the coffee gone cold, and her hands trembled when she handed it to me. "I don't know who to trust," she said, not looking at me, like my presence could somehow be a threat even though we had always been cordial. I forced a smile and told her I understood. It was a half-truth. I did understand, but in a limited, particular way. I understood the hunger to be seen and respected, the white-hot need to keep a little world whole. I also understood how quickly that hunger could make people do small, cruel things they rationalized as necessary. It made me look at what I had done without flinching. The road belonged to me and they had taken it, and the scales had to be balanced. But I also couldn't pretend that the ripples I'd made were clean. Then came the investigator. He showed up in a rented suit and shoes that had never seen gravel. His badge was real enough. I checked it with a disinterested suspicion of a man who trusts the law until it proves itself otherwise. He talked to the board in measured, pseudo-neutral terms, the kind of man who polishes his neutrality until it gleams. He asked questions that made the president and the treasurer look cornered. He logged every complaint, made notes, and then, in the manner of professionals who have no patience for theatrics, asked if anyone had motive, opportunity, or reason to make such mischief. Faces hardened. People glanced sideways, then looked down the way guilty people do whether or not they had anything to hide. There was a slow, delicious shift in the room when he asked those questions. Accusers became accused, and the board's telescope that had been aimed outward was suddenly turned inward. I kept my mouth shut. Of course, I let other people fill silence with accusations and replays of grudges. Watching them tear through their own carefully curated stories felt like watching termites devour a wooden porch. It didn't look dramatic at first, but was inevitable and thorough. There was a kind of justice in letting them discover their rot without my shovel. Yet the more they suspected one another, the more they demanded answers, and the more the board flailed to answer without appearing culpable. Threats of lawsuits were floated like balloons, expensive, hollow promises that needed gas to be anything more than spectacle. There was talk of involving the county, of challenging the annexation in the courts. They wanted a dramatic, legal resolution that would rebuke the person who had humiliated them and restore the world to the neat lines they preferred. I wished them luck with that. The law is a slow, lumbering machine compared to the quiet efficiency of the things I had set in motion. And lawsuits take time. Time is what I had bought by moving carefully. Some nights I would sleep poorly. I kept my door locked and the curtains drawn, because paranoia breeds paranoia. If you live by a venture that relies on stealth, the world outside begins to feel like a threat even when it isn't. I'd wake up sweating with the sensation that the whole neighborhood had turned into a jury waiting for me to confess on a stage my construction of an offense. Once or twice, I found myself at the edge of the subdivision at odd hours, watching lighted windows as if seeking confession in the warm flicker of television screens. There were times I felt like a child hiding behind a shed, peeking into adult arguments, both terrified and thrilled by the power I held to make those arguments happen. It wasn't all satisfaction, though. There were nights when I walked down my road and heard the wind through the trees and felt the land beneath my boots and remembered why I had built that asphalt in the first place. The road had been my anchor when the world felt unmoored, a symbol, a labor of love. It was also a practical matter. I depended on that road to send my truck into town for supplies, to keep my property accessible to the few friends who still visited. Watching it embroiled in a dispute that had spiraled beyond my original intention made me tired. I found myself missing the simplicity of a life where my hands hurt from honest work, and no one else claimed the labor as their own. There was a kind of loneliness in being right when so many were wrong. You win the argument and still stand alone. The local news started showing up one afternoon, a red light camera on their belt, and the kind of smile reporters wear when a small-town melodrama comes along and gives them content for a slow news cycle. They wanted interviews, human faces to translate the scandal into emotional currency their viewers could spend. The president of the HOA gave a carefully rehearsed statement about community safety and shared grief over violations of trust. The treasurer had a meltdown that played well on camera. Insulted, betrayed, a man who had never seen critics he could not affront. The segment painted the picture they wanted. A tight community under siege from an outside force that had no recognizable face. I watched the footage and felt that odd sensation people feel when they see their reflection from a distance, a recognition flanked by disappointment. They'd turn the narrative into something palatable, because palatable is a kind of power, the dull spoon of social acceptance. And yet, the more the cameras rolled, the more my work, my choices, spread like ink across the neighborhood's paper-thin certainties. Neighbors started to whisper about hires and contractors, as if inside jobs were the only plausible explanation. People who once shared sugar at the mailbox now eyed each other with competitiveness I'd never seen in years. It was as if my small operation had peeled back a layer of civility to reveal the raw edges underneath. The investigator kept asking questions quietly, methodically. I respected his professionalism in a way that surprised me. Even as I tried to be invisible, I didn't enjoy seeing the community tear itself apart for long. I was not someone who sought to ruin lives for sport. My aim had been correction, restitution, the retrieval of something basic that had been taken without consent. But patterns have a way of unspooling beyond your hands once the thread snaps. A man's actions often gain a life of their own. Then there was a night when everything almost fell apart. It was cool enough that the trees smelled like a coming season, but not cold, one of those late summer evenings that conspire to be deceptive. I'd been out, checking the perimeter, though I told myself it was only because I wanted to make sure no cameras had been positioned where I hadn't noticed. On the road back to my place, headlights sliced the darkness. 2 cars moving in a way that was not the usual neighborhood traffic. I froze on instinct and watched them pass, growing smaller as they rounded the curve. Something about their movement felt coordinated, deliberate. I thought briefly of the investigator, of whether the board had hired someone private to catch whoever had been messing with them. It was a reasonable guess, but the thought that followed was sharper. If they had someone watching, perhaps they weren't as helpless as I'd assumed. My heartbeat quickened in a way that made me conscious of the hair on my arms. I ducked into the shadow of a shed and watched as the headlights drew near. The cars slowed, and one of them turned onto the road that led to my place. The other kept going, as if providing support or lookout. For a breathless second, I imagined the worst. A raid, a confrontation, police lights painting trees in strobe colors. I considered leaving, walking down the hill into the safer anonymity of the town below. But I stayed. I wanted to see how the script would unfold. Part of me wanted to be a spectator, to watch the play and understand every line. The car rolled toward my gate and came to a stop. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that suggested authority. He had the look people get when they've been handed a part in someone else's drama, and they don't fully know the lines. He walked to the gate and peered to the chain link like a child trying to coax a skittish animal. "Anyone home?" he called in a voice that tried for casual and landed on suspicious instead. I stayed behind the shed and felt something cold and helpless. Was it fear, or was it the cold feeling you get when a plan you relied on for months suddenly faces variables you didn't account for? I could have come out and given myself up. That would have been an act of courage or madness, depending on how you unclassify it. Instead, I did the thing I'd always done. I watched and I waited. The man lingered, muttered into a phone, and then, after a time, it felt like a long, patient moment stitched into the night. He got back into the car and left. It was anticlimactic, and yet consequential. Whoever he was, he looked right into my property and not found me. That knowledge did something strange to me, equal parts thrill and dread. I had not been discovered, not that night, but I had been seen. That subtle shift matters. Once you know you exist to other eyes, your actions take on new weight. After that evening, I tightened my habits. I moved with more care and less swagger, more silence and less showmanship. I became a man of shadows and fine lines, measuring every step, not because of cowardice, but because of the recognition that what I had started could be dismantled if sloppy. There was also the creeping realization that the investigator might be closing in, or that the board might hire someone who had the resources to find the fingerprints I left in the air. That thought made me plan in a different key. Where once I'd been impulsive, I grew deliberate in a new, colder way. I stopped leaving things to chance. Still, there were moments, tiny insolent ones, where I allowed myself to breathe and remember the original hurt that had lit the match in the first place. I would walk the road at dawn, the mist clinging to the asphalt like a shawl, and think of how the labor of my hands had once been a private covenant between me and the land. I would recall my father's voice teaching me how to tend to machines, how to take care of what you build, and I would feel the old familiar pride that comes from the honest application of work. Those memories were not soft. They were iron. They told me why I had done what I had done and why, despite the cost, I could not turn back. The community, meanwhile, grew restless. New alliances formed in grocery store aisles and behind closed fences. People who'd never spoken now stood together in little cliques sharing theories, each one more elaborate than the last. Some suspected an outsider. Some suspected a disgruntled former employee of the landscaping company. Others whispered of a neighbor who had been slighted at some barbecue years earlier. The investigator kept asking questions and wove the answers into a tapestry that didn't include me, mostly because I was careful, too careful, and because human suspicion tend to find the nearest convenient scapegoat rather than the true architect of mischief. Yet even as my satisfaction grew, a small, stubborn voice inside me asked whether there wasn't a better way to reclaim my road that wouldn't push the community to the brink of tearing itself apart. That voice suggested a meeting, a negotiation, perhaps even an apology followed by an agreement that recognized my labor and my rights. It was a reasonable voice, the kind that might have saved a lot of headaches if I had listened. But listening would have required me to accept that the board, having already annexed the road without a conversation, might simply annex anything and everything it decided it wanted. And I had taught myself, through hard lessons learned low and slow, that sometimes the only language entitlement respects is consequence. So I kept going, Even when the voice at the back of my throat told me that vendettas have a way of spilling into places you never intended. The saga dragged on, months folding into one another like dull, dog-eared pages. The investigator filed reports that became documents on a shelf. The board passed measures to tighten security that cost them more than they planned. The neighborhood hummed with a new nervous energy. I walked my road in the half-light and tried to count the cost, not just of my pride, but the community I've been part of in a small, complicated way. There are many kinds of victories. Some are clear and blinding. Others are small and shadowed and leave a taste you can't quite name. Mine tasted like dry paper and the metallic tang of something newly righted, but not wholly clean. I had set a balance of sorts. I had made them feel the absence of something they'd taken for granted. But the ledger of consequences is never clean, and I knew, with a clarity that made my hands go cold, that there were more entries yet to be made. The nights grew longer and the air thicker with expectation, like the world was holding its breath waiting for something to break. I spent more time on the ridge, less time in my truck, and more time walking, boots sinking into the shoulder of the road, as if testing the earth's patience. Each step felt heavier because everything had weight now. The memory of the work I had done to build that road, the small, private rituals of my mornings, the tally of vehicles that had vanished, and the whispers that followed them. The investigator's quiet presence at meetings had become a steady drumbeat in the neighborhood's ears. His reports were less about sensational headlines and more about patterns he couldn't explain, which only made people angrier and more afraid. They wanted an enemy with a face, so they could protest and punish it. I wanted restitution. In the middle of all this, someone lit a fuse I hadn't intended. It was petty and human. A neighbor decided to put up a camera on the corner of his property that faced a road. One of those tacky, dome-shaped things you buy at the hardware store that records in grainy black and white and auto-sends clips to a cloud he didn't really understand. He posted a blurry video to the community's private group with a caption that invited outrage. In the footage, something moved at the edge of the frame, an outline that could be a raccoon or a person, and the comments were instantaneous and volcanic. The president of the HOA sent an email demanding anyone with information come forward. The treasurer posted a spreadsheet of potential losses. People who had been polite at barbecues began walking in pairs. The neighborhood felt like a ship with half its sails torn by a storm, directionless and trembling. I could have walked away then. I could have taken the satisfaction of seeing them spend their money and let the thing cool into memory. But there is a stubbornness in men who have been pushed out of their place that is not easily sated. Once you've had a thing taken from you with a shrug and a smile, a little fairness will not do. You want more than a return. You want acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. So I changed the script. Up until that point, I've been careful to make their troubles look like a series of unfortunate mechanical failures and clever misplacements. Now I needed a new move, something that would force a meeting in which the power would shift, even if only briefly, so they could see the human face behind what had happened. I wanted them to hear the reasons, to feel the labor I had poured into that stretch of asphalt. I wanted the president to look me in the eye, and for every smug phrase about community standards to sound thin and exposed. Maybe it was vanity. Maybe it was a final test. Either way, I prepared. The night I decided to act, the air held the first bite of autumn. I set the perimeter lights on timers, so they would go off in a staggered rhythm, misleading any casual observer about how many people were awake. I planted a small banner, nothing defamatory, only a strip of cloth with a simple message, in a clearing near the community sign. It read, modestly and plainly, "My road/my work." I left it there, partially hidden, because I wanted it to be discovered by the right eyes, not thrown into the trash as the work of an obvious saboteur. The banner didn't have to be dramatic. It simply needed to make a claim and invite the question of who had authority to make it. Early the next morning, a neighbor jogging by saw it, posted a photo, and the group erupted again. The president called an emergency meeting, and the treasurer sent yet another spreadsheet showing the expense of new security measures and proposed fees to cover them. They were in full panic mode, spending, planning, pointing fingers. That was my opening. I walked into the community center, like a man wronged but composed. I'd shaved, wore my oldest jacket that still had oil stains in the pockets, and kept my hands visible at my sides. The room smelled of stale coffee and sanitized anxiety. Faces turned as I entered. Speculations formed in a dozen minds about who I might be. I had been careful to be a background figure when necessary, but I was not unknown. There were nods from people who had traded polite greetings with me when we crossed paths, and there were frowns from those who still remembered the pitch of my refusal at the first annexation talk. I sat near the back where the acoustics were forgiving and waited for the board to begin. The president spoke in his practice cadence about safety and the importance of community consensus. He talked about cameras like they were talismans and called again for anyone with information to come forward. The investigator, lean and watchful, took notes. When the floor opened, people stood one after another to rehearse their fears and grievances. The woman with the polished SUV had a voice like glass, cracked and angry, and she described, with a composure that was brittle at the edges, the morning she found her car gone and the hours her family had spent searching. The treasurer presented numbers with the desperation of a man trying to stitch a torn suit with thread in the wrong color. An older man stood up and demanded moral clarity, as though deciding what was right could be tallied on a ledger. You could feel the room leaning toward a verdict that an outside force had invaded their peace. That's when I stood. I did not shout or plead. I did not make an entrance for dramatic effect. I simply walked to the front and asked for the floor. The murmurs swelled into a rustle of suspicion. The president's eyebrows arched in the way of a man expecting trouble and hoping it will pass him by. When I spoke, my voice was steady. The words were chosen and shaped by months of rehearsing answers to the questions I knew would be asked. I told them plainly that I had built the road, that I had paid for it in sweat and cash and long nights, and that their annexation had been done without my consent. I gave them the history. The mud and gravel before the asphalt, the winter freezes I'd patched, the delivery trucks I'd wrestled through at all hours. I stripped the narrative of hyperbole. I let the facts stand on their own. People listen the way people listen when they suddenly realize a story they thought was one thing might, in fact, be another. The president's mouth tightened into a thin line. The treasurer's face drained slightly as the numbers I mentioned, labor hours and material costs, began to register against the sums they had spent on the official improvements they claimed they had made. The investigator leaned forward, the pen in his hand suddenly heavier. For a moment, the room was nothing but a collection of small exhalations. Pen set down, chairs creaking, breath held. Then, like a chord struck at the wrong time, the president asked how I'd been compensated for my work. It was a line they wanted. It would justify everything, allow them to wear the mantle of reason instead of avarice. I told him there had been no compensation, and that was the root of it. I told them I had been ignored and overridden by votes that represented a comfort their privileged convenience had no right to assume. In that brief exchange, something shifted. The room felt thinner, like a curtain that had been pulled aside, and showed the wires behind. That night did not end in the theater of accusation that some had anticipated. It did not end with the board triumphantly reaffirming its rules. Instead, it became a messy negotiation in public view, an economy of grievances and demands traded across a table. The investigator suggested a mediation. The president resisted, but could not say no outright in front of a crowd. The treasurer, who had always been pragmatic in a way that masked his insecurity, proposed that the HOA formally recognize my contribution in a way that would not only return some measure of respect, but also defuse the rising tide of litigation. It was a compromise wrapped in bureaucratic language, an easement, a maintenance agreement, a formal acknowledgement that the road had originated as my work. It sounded bureaucratic because it was meant to sound safe. It gave them a path to save face while providing me a way to reassert my rights. I agreed to mediation primarily because the alternative, years of expensive legal back and forth, would have eaten at the thin margin of my patience and pocket. The alternative also risked turning neighbors into enemies permanently. The mediation would be a place to set terms, to perhaps get documentable recognition of what had been taken. For now, it felt like a step toward reclaiming not just asphalt but dignity. The weeks that followed the meeting were strange in their mixture of relief and continued wariness. Officials wrote documents. Lawyers drew lines in the sand with language that smelled faintly of ambition rather than justice. The investigator filed his interim reports. They were careful, clinical, and left room for every possible explanation. Neighbors watched one another more carefully than before, and awkwardness filled the spaces where friendly chit-chat had once lived. I found myself being asked to come to small, private meetings where the treasurer wanted to make sure the numbers were right. I met with a lawyer who explained, in patient legalese, the difference between an easement, an adverse possession claim, and a formal recognition. I listened and learned. The law, which had once been an abstract talisman in the president's mouth, became a set of levers that could be pulled if you knew where to put your weight. Even with these developments, not everyone was placated. There were heated calls and anonymous messages, and a car that went missing in a way that felt more personal, the kind of disappearance that left a family raw and ready for blame. Some neighbors accused me outright in whispers that slid past the polite veneer of their voices at the grocery store. I expected that. Notoriety is a small tax you pay when you refuse to be invisible. But there were also moments of humanity. An elderly woman who lived by the cul-de-sac brought me a pie and told me, quietly, that she remembered when I first started working on the road, and that she'd always thought it would be something special. Those gestures mattered as much as a legal paper. They were the small stitches mending a fabric that my actions had frayed. By the time mediation actually occurred, both sides were exhausted and wary. The mediator, a woman with a surgical calm, listened as I explained my labor in detail, and as the HOA board explained their reasoning for annexation, which boiled down convenience dressed in the clothing of community benefit. There were concessions and claims exchanged like currency. We struck an agreement that allowed for shared maintenance responsibilities for the short term, a formal recognition of my initial work, and an eventual vote by the community to decide whether the road would be deeded into the HOA with appropriate compensation or remain an easement with a maintenance agreement that recognized my role. It was not a triumph of righteous indignation nor a total surrender. It was a real, messy compromise that admitted in legal form that the road had not simply appeared by consensus. The president signed reluctantly. The treasurer did so with a face like a man who had swallowed a bitter pill. Walking home that evening, the road under my boots felt both vindicated and oddly fragile. I had gotten what I wanted in the sense that the record now read differently, that the history of the asphalt was no longer something the HOA could simply overwrite in their newsletters. But the costs had been considerable. Months of strain, the eroding of neighborly trust, nights that were sleepless. I had shifted the balance of power enough to make them negotiate, but the truth remained that the paper did not repair every hurt and that the board's appetite for control had not been entirely extinguished. There was a long-term battle still in play, one that involved votes and deeds and the slow churn of legal proceedings, and I would have to keep my eyes open in a new way. The road belonged to me in memory and effort, if not yet in absolute legal title, and that would have to be enough for now. The dust didn't settle the way I thought it would. After mediation, after the signatures and the stamped papers, after the nervous handshakes that felt more like rehearsed theater than true gestures of peace, I expected the neighborhood to drift back into its ordinary rhythms. But nothing really returned to normal. The road, my road, was no longer just a strip of asphalt connecting houses to the highway. It was a line in the sand, a reminder of the war that had been fought quietly in driveways, board meetings, and sleepless nights. People still drove over it. But now their tires seemed to hesitate, their eyes flicking toward my house on the ridge as though they half expected me to appear on the porch with a ledger of names. The board members tried to reclaim their authority with newsletters about flower beds and recycling schedules, but every line they wrote carried a shadow of what had happened, like ink smeared over a page that could never quite be cleaned. I didn't vanish any more cars after that. The point had been made, the lesson delivered, but the legend had taken root. Children whisper about the man on the hill who could make vehicles disappear, and adults, even when they didn't say it aloud, carry that same unease in their eyes when we cross paths at a gas station or in the grocery aisle. For me, the road became something more than an argument or a piece of property. It was a mirror of my life, carved out of stubbornness and grit, stolen and then reclaimed, scarred but still standing. Every crack in its surface reminded me of the years I spent hauling stone and pouring asphalt, of the solitude that sharpened me, of the arrogance that tried to erase me. I began walking it every evening, boots pressing into the surface as the sun dipped below the horizon, and in those walks I felt a strange peace settle in. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about owning the truth of what I had built, whether or not anyone else wanted to admit it. The HOA could pass all the resolutions they wanted, they could hold meetings until their voices turned hoarse, but they couldn't change the fact that I had been here first, that I had made something out of nothing, and that without me, the road simply wouldn't exist. That truth was mine to keep untouchable. The funny thing about power is that people only respect it when it's visible. The HOA had their clipboards, their rules, their votes. I had the kind of power they didn't understand. The quiet kind, the kind that didn't need to be broadcast to be felt. They thought they had humbled me with their annexation, but in the end, they had written my name into their own history, whether they liked it or not. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was a shadow that lingered at the edge of their every decision, the man who had forced them to recognize what they had tried to take. And maybe that was enough. Life went on, as it always does. Seasons changed. Kids grew taller, and the board cycled through new members who thought they were stepping into ordinary roles without realizing the ground they walked on was marked with a memory of a fight they hadn't been there to see. Every now and then, one of them would stop me with a question about the maintenance agreement or the easement terms, and I would answer calmly, firmly, without bitterness. They needed to know I wasn't their enemy, but I wasn't their pawn either. I was simply the man who had built the road, and that meant I would always have a voice, whether they invited it or not. Looking back now, I don't regret what I did. I don't regret the sleepless nights, the careful planning, the vanished cars that taught them fear. Some people say I went too far, that I should have handled it through courts and committees, that I should have swallowed my pride for the sake of harmony. But harmony without respect is just silence forced upon the unwilling. They took from me without asking, and I answered in the only language they understood: power. My road still stands, scarred but proud, and so do I. And every time I walk its length at sunset, I remember the man I had to become to protect it. Not just a landowner, not just a neighbor, but a reminder carved into asphalt that some things cannot be taken without consequence.